Welcome to the Dansox Roundtable discussion, based on the lectures for Dance Scholarship Oxford's Virtual Summer School. I'm Sue Jones, Director of Dansox at St Hilda's College, University of Oxford. You can see all the lectures on St Hilda's Jacqueline Dupré Music Building YouTube channel. My thanks today go to Daniel Carey, Director of the Moore Institute, National University of Ireland, Galway, for providing this webinar service to make this event happen, and especially to David Kelly, who's pulling the strings behind the scenes. It's been quite an experience, everyone recording in isolation, and today is in fact the first time we're all in the same, albeit virtual, space. It's as near as we can get to the question sessions, the coffee breaks, the ad hoc conversations that come up in person at the usual summer school. My huge thanks to all the panelists for giving their time today, and we give our apologies to our special guest, Alistair Macaulay, who had to record his lecture twice, and to the viewers who have had trouble seeing all of the clips when we encountered some technical issues. We're still working on a third perfect version, so watch this space. When I was looking through the comments and the questions for this webinar, Susanna Reese's struck me because she was talking about how today we have this focus on the corporeal when we've been reminded so viscerally recently of our bodily vulnerabilities. I'm now going to introduce each speaker and then they will take over the floor. So Marcus Bell is currently a doctoral student working in the classics with Fiona McIntosh at Oxford. His work focuses on the often contested relationships of the classical and the postmodern at the turn of the 21st century. Gabriella Minden is also a doctoral student in English at Oxford, researching the impact of the ballet russe on early 20th century British drama. Megan Smith is a finalist in English, and she just received word that she got a first class, so we're congratulating her today. She wrote her undergraduate dissertation on literary writing in dance and its theoretical implications in the 20th and 21st centuries. Joseph Kay is a composer and sound artist who has presented in Oxford, London, Europe, Japan. He recently completed his PhD in Oxford, and his work explores queerness and noise through collaborative multimedia practices. Susie Crow is well known to Dansox. She's an Oxford-based choreographer, teacher, and practitioner of ballet. She danced with Royal and Sadler's Wells ballet companies and has a PhD in dance from the University of Roehampton. Our special guests for the section on Paul Taylor are Parisa Khobdeh, an internationally renowned dancer, repetiteur, teacher, who worked with Paul Taylor for 16 years, and now she's working on film and dance through her creative vehicle, Parisa Khobdeh Dance. Alistair Macaulay is an internationally acclaimed writer and critic of dance and drama, who has also taught and lectured widely on the history of dance, and he is also well known to Dansox supporters. Now I'll hand over to Marcus to begin.
Hi, thank you very much, Sue, and thank you very much to everyone else who's joining us today for the webinar. My name is Marcus. I'm a DPhil student in the classics faculty, and I'm looking at the relationship between postmodern and the classical. And my talk that I gave as part of the summer school was on Pina Bausch and the company's relationship with the tragic. So I looked at an example from Nelkin and thought about the ways in which the tragic is being kind of dynamically integrated in the work, and also the things that people have said about the Bausch company that is particularly tragic. So I looked at a particular example from the middle of that section and how deconstruction can be a space for the tragic to come into the choreography, into the bodies on stage. Great.
Hi, I'm Gabriella. I'm also a DPhil student here, but in the English faculty. And broadly, my lecture looked at the relationship between Diaghilev's Ballet Russe and early 20th century British theatre, and specifically W.H. Audin's The Dance of Death, which was produced by the London-based experimental group theatre in 1935. So this work was hailed by theatre critics of the time as an epoch-making development because it used not only text, but also choreography, corporeal rhetoric, and visual metaphor in the sort of creation of dramatic effect. So for the most part, people have attributed this sort of formal innovation to Audin, the playwright, who was, of course, a very important figure. But I looked at the way in which Rupert Doone, a former Diaghilev dancer and founder of the group theatre, catalyzed and shaped the creation of this sort of novel, poetic, dramatic form.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Gabriella. Megan.
Hi, everyone. I'm Megan. I've just graduated in English from Oxford, and my lecture was a section from my dissertation that was supervised by Sue, and it focused on John Haskell's The Complete Ballet, a fictional essay in 5 acts, which is a sort of text that blends ballet and literary theory, and sort of performance theory and body theory as well. And I looked at the way in which writing about dance and about ballet could contribute and sort of nuance and complicate our received bodies of literary theory, namely deconstruction and gaze theory. And I just thought that was really exciting.
Well, it was, Megan. You gave a
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Joseph, you're next.
So my talk addressed relationships between dance notation and I suppose I came to this topic for 2 reasons. First was my interest as a composer and musicologist in the role that notation has to play within musical processes, particularly when it comes to ways in which the body intervenes within musical communication. The second was a kind of frustration. In much of the literature on dance notation that I read, where musical notation is discussed, it's discussed kind of in its most basic form. So I wanted to bring some attention to some developments in musical notation that incidentally were concurrent with the development of carbon notation and also to set out an idea for some practice-based research. Hopefully, trying to find a way to help carry this very interesting conversation about dance notation forward from a perspective.
Hello, I'm Susie Crow.
I forgot to unmute myself, sorry. Off you go, Susie.
I'm Susie Crow, and I'm an independent ballet choreographer and teacher and artist. And I've my doctoral research was into the ballet class and how it impacts on the education of dancers as creative. And so my presentation looks at a pilot study which I did looking at a very particular ballet class as a preparation for research in the field, looking at a range of ballet classes for dancers over the age of 18, but very wide range of dancers. And I suppose it became about an exercise in how do we document the ballet class. There's a lot of very interesting and scholarly discussion about works of choreography and important practitioners, but the ballet class, which is like the elephant in the room in ballet practice, doesn't always get massively discussed. And so this was an exercise in documenting the class, trying to see its assumptions and the things that are taken for granted as a preparation for going out into the field. And I chose to look at a video in the public domain to give me the opportunity to really look deeply before going out to where I would probably not be allowed to video. So I'm sharing with you the topics and issues that I saw emerging from that particular class, which were to inform my thinking. And I've tried to kind of contextualize them a little bit in the current situation.
Thank you very much, Susie. Parisa, lovely to have you with us.
Where's she gone?
I think you need to unmute.
Can you hear me now?
Yes,
There you are.
loud and clear.
Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm Parisa Khobdeh. I'm a former tailor dancer. I just retired in November of 2019 at Lincoln Center in New York after a 16-year dance career. And my discussion was just a taste of Paul Taylor's history, his personal background, also what the day in the life of a tailor dancer and what it was like to create with the man himself. And then I discussed some various forms of style and how Paul's corporeal history, in fact, impacted how it influenced his movement language. And then we took a look in the lecture at how Paul's choreographically, how his craft developed, his background as a painter, as a dancer, as an athlete. But we really start to see how his compositional background with art, how it impacted how he created dance by using obstacles of ideas, obstacles of structure, and so on.
Thank you very much, Parisa. We'll be talking to you again later. Alistair, would you give us a couple of minutes on what we could see or hear of your lecture?
Happily. Can you hear me, see me all right?
Yes,
Good.
Very good, thank you.
It's funny, I've been a critic now for 42 years, and I've been talking about dance in educational circumstances for 40 years, and yet I still find it's only when you finished saying or writing something that you realize what you wanted to say, and what is sometimes your abiding theme. And I realize as I end this talk about Paul Taylor that I'm trying to appraise him as I do with all the great choreographers, really to analyze them as dramatic poets and to see his work as dramatic poetry, and then to go into some of the detail of what that's about in his work, how it operates upon us. I'm also trying to put him historically into context, the earlier modern dance people who influenced him, the people whom he then influenced, and therefore seeing him as part of the mainstream of modern dance, perhaps the mainstream. If you live in New York, you are intensely aware that Paul Taylor has a central place in American modern dance. He alone has a season each year, I mean this after his death, but it's still true, lasting about 3 weeks. It sometimes used to be 4 weeks with an orchestra in a theater in which you could also see a ballet company. For many years it was New York City Center, and now it's the New York State Theater at Lincoln Center. That's a phenomenal achievement. I suppose the other two things I wanted to say is to analyze them both as therefore the orthodoxy of modern dance, and also to go into what is deeply perverse, unorthodox about him and how these two coexist, and an obsession of mine to see how these things operate in terms of musicality.
That's great. Thank you very much, Alistair. That puts it all in a nutshell. In fact, I think we might start with one of the questions that came up from Sheila Forbes. She said that she had, seen many of your lectures on Balanchine, on Cunningham and Ashton and so on and so forth. And she knew about all these stars, star choreographers, but she didn't know about Taylor. And she was very clear from both your lecture and from Parisa's that Taylor is incredibly influential. Is it because we live in the UK or in Ireland indeed that we don't know about Paul Taylor? Maybe you first and then Parisa.
Yes, I'll come in first. I so well remember, let me think, 38 years ago at the founding weekend of what became the Dance Research Society in London, Clement Cresp gave a talk called The Critic's Task, and he was explaining how his point, I think he said, My talk has a subtitle, A Voice from the Harem or the Eunuch's Complaint, which took our breath away. And then he said, because my theme is the total impotency of the critic. And his point was that he wanted the critic to be powerful, but actually a critic has damn all power. And he went for the example of Paul Taylor. He said, every time Paul Taylor has come to London with his company, he has had raves from all the critics. He does not fill the theatres, but when he only sells when Rudolf Nureyev appears as his guest artist.
Right.
So that's something perverse in the British audience. Paul Taylor's always had great admirers in the British dance establishment, from Margot Fontaine and Bob Cohan. He's been in the repertory of London Contemporary Dance Theatre, the Old Rambert, other companies too, but it hasn't often got through to the general audience.
Okay. Parisa, what do you think about that?
It's a question that I have as well. I tend to agree. Alistair and I had a conversation once. Alistair, you spoke about the Americana and how the Brits weren't very interested in that. And it's funny enough because that same week I saw a musical performance in Camden, and the house was packed, and it was these two cowboys from California. and I was curious. I was like, there's clearly an audience, but but to your point, in terms of, I believe Susan Maguire was the director at London Contemporary Dance back in the 80s or 90s.
I think in the mid-90s.
Yeah. So there was a presence, and I believe Dan Wagner at some point.
Yes.
But in terms of ballet companies, I know Rambert has, under the direction of Mark Baldwin, there were a few restagings of his work. But I'm curious, and I'm eager to introduce and change that.
I think you're going to do that. I think you both are. I'm sure we all have views about Paul Taylor, but I'd like to bring in some others here. There were a lot of questions for Marcus, so you'd better get back on the on the stump. And there's a question here from Ségolène Tarte, who is a follower who's come to many of our events, and she talks about how you talked about the transitions, the framing, the editing that make the meaning in Bausch. I agree. She says, I agree, yet it strikes me that in her experience, she would rather have said that these transitions elicit feeling rather than meaning. I mean, would you like to address that issue a little bit? Do you think that there's a difference between artists who are primarily meaning makers and those that are primarily feeling elicitors?
Thank you, and thank you for the question. I thought it was a really, really generative way for thinking about what's going on here in this work. I immediately called to mind the work on queer dramaturgies being done by people like Alison Campbell and Stephen Farrier, who talk about this relationship between meaning and feeling. Talk about those moments that we witness something in a theatrical context or in a performance context that hit us first as spaces of feeling, of moments of affective quality and force, that for some time seem to almost transcend or come before the meaning happens. That we have this moment of, oh my gosh, I feel this in my body, in my stomach, in my chest, but the meaning is kind of coming later to make sense of it potentially. They use kind of queer dramaturgies to think about this in the context of Brian Masumi, who's a theorist.
Oh yes, yeah, interesting.
And I think Masumi's take on affect is useful here because Masumi says that it's sometimes the strength of the image, it's an emotional affective quality. It's the way it's structured, the way it affects us, its quality, its texture, that then informs the meaning that's made from it afterwards.
So they basically both. An intersection. Would you agree with that, Susie, in your choreographic practice? That you can't quite separate out feeling and meaning.
Oh, she's muted.
You're muted, Susie.
Yes, I think it's a very, I also think there's the meaning sits in a very interesting place between the performer, or the creator, and the audience. The meaning is somehow sits somewhere in the middle of that. That is really, so whatever the intention of the creator, you can never be quite sure. The meaning is a construct of that relationship, it seems to me.
Right. Yeah. It seems to be very much part of Bausch's work. I mean, there are a couple more questions for Marcus. You seem to have elicited a lot of questions on tragedy. Here's one from Renate Bräuninger. She said, are you familiar with Gerald Siegmund's article on how contemporary Pina Bausch's work still is? I'll send you all that after the event. You probably know it anyway. But she was wondering to which suppression through police and state power you're referring in your talk. You know, to the Nazi regime or to the 1960s in Germany or the time of RAF terrorism. She says that for her, tragedy of Bausch's character shows the highly traumatized West German population whose traumas were not supposed to exist and were hence not recognized or treated. So, you know, is Bausch screaming for these kinds of things on stage? And that's a question that elicits yes or no, and we're always told not to ask questions like that, but perhaps you could elaborate a bit on that point.
Thank you. Maybe I can find a way of relating it to the article mentioned, because in the beginning of this, and I was lovely to receive this question in advance, so I got a chance to return to the article.
Great.
And have a look over it. And
Great.
I think there's a bit at the
beginning. It worked.
It's happening. Which is useful for thinking about it, of this idea of the contemporary as something that is historically variable and embedded, but gains specificity, or can be called something that might be related to ontology, right, depending on the conditions in which it's coming about. I think it relates to what Susie was saying, this relationship between the performer and the audience and the making of meaning in that moment. So what I would say about the state oppression is totally right to call me up on this, because I was too vague about this in my paper. And I've been thinking about it since, and this question has helped me a lot in terms of an idea of memory, in terms of the idea of Bausch staging this relationship to the past, this relationship to the memory of World War II and the experiences there. But at the same time, this can remain open in the historical conditions, in the contemporary, the many contemporary moments in which the piece is reperformed. So
Okay. Alistair sent in a question about tragedy and about, you know, that you hadn't thought of Bausch necessarily as tragic, and what kind of tragic are we referring to here? Whose definition of tragedy? I wonder if anyone, Alistair, please ask the question, but I'm wondering if anyone else has anything to contribute on that point.
I mean, I'll just come in while others are shaping their brains about this, but I asked it because 100 years ago, when I studied at the other university, Cambridge, I had a very fierce English literature supervisor about tragedy who really wouldn't accept even Ibsen as a tragedian. And he really made me work out why Greek playwrights were tragic, why Shakespeare was in his tragedies, and what constitutes tragedy. Now, of course, we don't have to accept his theory, but I just wonder if you have any working definition of the tragic that applies to Bausch.
Right. Anyone else want to go at that? No, we'll wait. We'll wait for, maybe those responses will come in later in the chat. But I'd like to move on now to, let me see, questions for Joseph from Segalen. I think you've had this one in advance, haven't you? About what kind of cultural encoding would your sort of ideal notation constitute? And are you in search of a way of notating dance and music together?
Well,
Joseph, any thoughts on that?
well, again, as Marcus said, this was a question that really helped to clarify my thinking. And I think I'm not so much interested in encoding or encapsulating anything, partly because I'm most interested in notation as a kind of live contributor to the network of meaning.
Yes.
So I'm kind of more interested, I suppose, in collaboratively kind of igniting new ways of thinking that will then lead to new ways of practice,
Right.
both in music and in dance. So I'm
Right.
certainly not claiming that I have the answer to some kind of great system that can do both. Not at all. But I'm interested to see how dance notation, viewed in the same kind of way that action-based notation in music is used, how that could kind of invigorate notation in a different kind of way, and what would result from that.
Right. Does anyone have any comments on that particular configuration of dance and musical notation? I mean, it seemed to me extremely productive, what you were doing, and extremely experimental. And I think I have maybe a question here from Renata again, our German friend who is was also a musicologist, as well as a dance scholar. So she said it was one of her areas of research, and she valued very much the points you were making. She was wondering how familiar you are with the use of scores in contemporary dance practice. You know, a score in this context could be anything from a photograph, a drawing, a painting, a written text. And this might actually bring us to some of the other papers that we've had, you know, from Megan, for example, from Marcus. What, any comments on that?
I mean, it's something that I am at least familiar with, although I haven't had a huge amount of experience of. And the reason why I invoked graphic scores in particular, you know, Cardew, wasn't so much to use them as a model, but rather to talk about the fact that there is a kind of, there's a school of reading that kind of notation, and that it's not, and it's quite a sort of carefully codified school. So it's not so much using something as a prompt for improvisation. I think that's quite key.
Right.
So, I mean, it could kind of, I mean, really it could start from either direction, but I mean, the idea that I outlined started from, or would start from, a pretty strict transcription of a particular notation system, kind of a formal translation of a particular piece of notation even into a piece of music, and then see what that sets in motion. So again, it's not so much about finding new strategies of notation, but more kind of delving into what existing strategies have to offer.
Right. That seems to sum up what you're talking about. Does anyone have anything to add to that? Having seen the lecture at all? Megan, do you? I wondered if you have anything to add there on the idea of writing as a form of notation or transmission of dance.
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting. I really liked the idea of like using the written in a more live sense.
Yes.
To stop it from feeling sort of static or fixed. I think it's in a Mark Franco article where he talks about dance notation taking away that sense of enunciation, which sort of is the, using terms from linguistics, so that's, you know, the act of actually doing it with the body, as you were talking about. And I was wondering really if this way of using notation and body practice together in an infused kind of way was almost putting the oral and like an oral tradition back into the use of written, if that makes sense. Kind of blending the two.
Yes, well, how does the corporeal fit there?
I suppose I'm using
The body
oral.
and the text. Are you using this as a metaphor?
I think so. I think enunciation and oral as borrowed terms from linguistics to talk about things happening within the body, things that are knowledge stored within the body, not within text.
Right, yes. And in fact, actually, we have a comment here from Renata who said that dancers' experiences of using the visual scores might influence you, I guess, when they work with you. I think she must have been talking about Joseph, but it would apply also to Megan. Yes, Susie.
I'm just going to make an incredibly basic practical point really here about the fact that you don't read while you dance. There's a fundamental one's relationship to a score, and I have done improvisation prompted from visual scores, and I've also worked with painters in a collaborative interaction, painting and responding to what they paint, and them responding to what I do, also with musicians, which was wonderfully rich and interesting. But it does, and you brought it up I thought your distinction, Joseph, about notation as being either prescriptive or descriptive was key here, really, in that it's very difficult for it to be prescriptive in the dance world. We are all, as far as notation goes, we are mostly functionally illiterate. So in terms of dance notation, so it's not. I think there are very few of us that have much of that could learn a piece from a score, and it would be very slow. As notating dance is an extremely slow process, inevitably, because the human body is very complex. So the slightest movement or posture requires a huge amount of information to give an accurate depiction of it, really. So I think I think your project sounds absolutely fascinating. Love to be involved in that, but there is this very I don't know how you bridge that, rather, or there is that very basic practical difference in how you might relate to a score.
I suppose. Sorry.
Yes.
Could I ask a quick question about the education in the UK in terms of dance education?
Yeah.
Is dance notation common in the UK here?
I don't think it is. When I was at the Royal Ballet School, we all did Benish notation. So I did 2 years of Benish notation as a study, but I don't think it's there now.
I think it's
RAD uses it now to record its syllabi, and the Benish Institute is actually based within the RAD, and it's much more. So I suppose in a way, the UK is more of a home for Benish than for Laban, perhaps. Partly because the Royal Ballet embraced Benish as a way of recording all its work, and Kenneth Macmillan in particular was an extremely strong supporter of it. So any work, pretty much everything that's in the Royal Ballet's repertoire is available in Benish notation. But having the knowledge to go and read it, it's also, I think it's also worth saying about Benish that it's very, it came out of notating ballet, and it's developed massively into more complex areas since then. But it's kind of simpler to grasp in the context of ballet, I think, possibly.
Right. I think that's the crucial distinction from musical notation, is that dancers don't automatically learn how to do it. Whereas most of the companies who can afford one have a choreologist to notate the scores. But
I think it's also a case.
Yes.
I think it's also true that American companies simply don't often use notators. It's much more common in British and I think European ones. Balanchine wasn't really interested in notation. He got rid of Laban quite early on, and Benish. They came and went, but generally he thought that ballet was ahead of notation, and no notator could catch the details that he wanted. Anthony Tudor and Doris Humphrey did like Laban notation, but it's not widespread in American dance. Is that? I should get back to Parisa. How much is there in the Taylor Company?
Well, actually, I was going to say, I can't speak for conservatory education, but for undergrad BFAs, dance notation is, I took dance notation. I took 2 years of dance notation. And I have to say, it's like, it's harder than riding a bike. After a few years away from it, it was almost unrecognizable, but when I restaged the word at the College of William and Mary, I used it. I was literate enough that I could rely on it, and just so happened that my assistant was she was a master of Laban notation. But a lot of Paul's works, they had funding for many years. There was always a notator in the room. Esplanade has been notated. I'm not sure when the funding stopped, but it all came down to money at some point. But a lot of those are recorded.
Good.
That's really interesting. Gabriella, we have 2 questions for you. One from Lyndall Gordon and one from Alistair. I can't find them on my piece of paper, but I'll try and remember them. The one from Lyndall Gordon was about the way when she heard your lecture, she was reminded of Robert Helpman's production of T.S. Eliot's Murder in the Cathedral and the way in which Helpman used the chorus there. I wondered if you had anything to say about that, and the way in which Rupert Doone may well have had an impact on that production.
Yeah, I think it's right on. And
I think the dates are right, by the way.
They were certainly moving in the same circles at that time. And of course, the Dance of Death was also sharing programs with Eliot's work. So I think there was a lot of cross-fertilization. But of course, Helpman and de Valois and Doone were all sort of working in the, I guess, the cross between dance and drama. And I think there was a lot of ideas that were being shared and built upon. I don't know the exact relationship between the Dance of Death and Helpman's work, but it's something that I've been looking into since you sent that a few days ago. Yeah.
Right. That's great. And Alice's question was about Britain.
Benjamin Britten.
Yes, Benjamin Britten. Sorry, we've been talking about the UK a lot. Yes. Do you want to give the question, or shall I? I can read it out.
No, I can put it. I was just curious if there's any direct link between the Rupert Doone production and Benjamin Britten's 1936 score, Our Hunting Fathers, which has words by Auden, some of them culled from older English literature, and it's I think it has 5 sections, and the 4th one is called The Dance of Death. And I just wonder how close the link is. I've always wanted someone to choreograph that Benjamin Britten score, which I think is just great. Not obviously dancey, but nonetheless.
Yeah, I don't know whether there was a direct influence there. When you asked that question earlier today, I got it and was thinking what possibly could have happened is at the beginning of the Dance of Death, Doone actually wanted an Orpheus production from Auden. But Auden said, well, how about if I do a Dance of Death instead? And it ended up some sort of mixture of the two. And it's possible that Auden took his interest in the Dance of Death and sort of put it into a different channel with Britain. The direct influence, I don't know.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much, Gabriella. Now I'm going to move on to, there's a couple of questions that will probably overlap between Parisa and Susie, because they're about practical matters here. And one of them is about the kind of techniques of class. How would you talk about class, Parisa, in relation to, you know, your experiences? I mean, how would you experience a ballet class in particular? In relation to the development of your artistry, as opposed to mere athleticism, because we've talked a lot about Taylor's athleticism, but of course he was a great artist.
I think that ballet is one of the most systematic techniques. While it's not essential, I do think it is necessary as a tailor artist. I feel that for the tailor style, having the exposure to ballet is really important in terms of articulation of the feet, the ankles, and being able to propel and travel through space, which poses an interesting question in lockdown. How can people move when they have 1 meter of space to dance in? But I think that in terms of I was classically trained in the Balanchine method before I even I had modern exposure in college. That was when I saw the work of like Taylor and Bausch and Graham and Cunningham and all these modern choreographers. But ballet was my launching point, and I think ultimately, having performed so many classical ballets, the performative aspect was essential. Being able to perform in terms of like whether it was character or just abstract, or not necessarily abstract, but virtuosic dancing. I think that impacted my artistry, and turning that into I think I might be jumping the gun here. There was a question about how to train in
That's
lockdown.
Right. Yes. Yeah.
And my advice or my take on that is something that was essential when creating with Paul Taylor was, as he was making and sculpting something, you performed it 200% so that he could see if it worked. So for that, I say, when we don't know when we'll be back in theaters, as you're keeping your bodies honed, keep that performative aspect, breaking through the walls of your tiny homes, or at least my home is tiny.
That's brilliant. That actually leads us on to a question that Maggie Watson put in for both you and Parisa, for you and Susie, about how do you go about keeping up the training in these days? You know, of the small box, in the small frame, in the kitchen, in the living room.
Susie, do you want to
contribute there?
Yeah, I think I do want to just add to what Parisa's just said about performance and the old thing that always used to be said to us: if you can't do it in the studio, you won't do it on the stage. You know, so it was all very much about, you know, you need to perform in the studio. You can't just expect it to happen like magic. Although there are some people for whom it does happen like magic, but you can't rely on that. I think in terms of, I thought about this question, and I was thinking one of the interesting things that came up in my research was the concept of deliberate practice, and the notion that, you know, we learn things, we acquire skills, and we get to a certain consciously, we like learning to drive, we learn consciously, we get to a certain point where we have competence, and as soon as we've got a competent level, it slips back into our unconscious, and we maintain a level of competence, but we don't progress necessarily, we plateau. And it's the concept of deliberate practice, and I'm just going to refer to it's Erickson talks about this and says why certain artists get better is because they never allow themselves to slip into that place of acceptable competence, that they are perpetually upping the challenge a little. and it's a very subtle distinction. It's setting challenges that are achievable so that you don't become despondent and lose it, but that you are constantly questioning and constantly working on things, setting tasks that will enable things to improve. And it's not necessarily about doing more complicated things, which obviously in our tiny spaces we're very limited on certain aspects of technique, either by the size of the space or the nature of the surface we may be dancing on. But perhaps also in terms of deepening our understanding of the things that we can do and refining and, you know, it's improving what we can do. And so I would say that in a funny way, this is an opportunity to really look deeply into our practice, not think out, but actually really investigate within our practice to make it more accurate, more rich, more refined, our understanding, develop our understanding. And I'm always really impressed by the way musicians acquire habits of independent solitary practice on their instruments. And I think dancers have got terribly used to doing their practice communally in a class and perhaps not thinking independently on their own, not acquiring habits of independent practice. So maybe that is something we can really usefully develop while we're at home alone, is develop our understanding of how to practice independently. And that could be actually fabulously enriching for when we do go back in the studio and we have got more space and we have got people to respond to and react to, that we will bring a kind of depth and refinement, maybe.
That sounds very interesting. Has anyone got a comment on that? Do you feel that musicians, Joseph and Alistair and everybody,
I love the musical
Marcus,
point.
do you? Yeah.
I was just thinking cynically that dancers should all develop their inner Alicia Markova. She was, of course, the ballerina not known ever to be seen taking class over 30 years of her career. People used to stand at the door of her dressing room thinking, can we hear a single noise of her moving? But nobody ever saw her do even a plie.
Right, wonderful. What do you think, Joseph? Sorry.
No, just it was a couple of things I wanted to add, but just go, Joseph.
But this is just a kind of side note, but I think this speaks really interestingly to Susie, what you were saying about I focus on physical conditioning seeming to come at the cost of artistry. And it seems that I sort of feel that musicians could do with a bit more guided physical conditioning, because the downside to all the solitary practice is ingraining like body habits that aren't useful for the art as well as for the health of the performer. So like maybe then perhaps this speaks to notation, sorry to bring it back there, but this idea that music is of the mind rather than of the body. Not only does that, I would argue, limit creative musical progress, but also damage the bodies of musicians or put the bodies of musicians at risk. So certainly we can learn from each other.
Wonderful.
Can I respond?
Susie.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really interesting point, and that is one of the worries, that when you work on your own, you solidify potentially harmful habits, really. But I think what we do need to do is to question more what we do, get into a good habit of actually interrogating our practice. And I think that would, because my feeling is that we perhaps don't understand the resource as ballet dancers that we have. It's a massive, massive resource. And there's an awful lot that can be discovered within it and explored about how it works, how it actually works mechanically. You know, it's not, I don't think the scientists have a monopoly on understanding how the body actually works when it's doing this material. And I think we need to kind of, I think, again, without putting ourselves physically at risk or going down rabbit holes of bad habits, I think we can explore, and that means, I think, looking at being more inventive about what we do with the material, exploring it from different perspectives, not always doing chassé pas de bourrée the same way, but, you know, try doing chassé pas de bourrée backwards. It's a very different matter. And reversing things, doing things on the other side. You know, there's an awful lot that we can do to really safely explore our understanding of how this movement material functions.
Susie, I wonder if I can ask you, or ask all of you, would you say that is true of musical practice, that you tend to experiment with particular, you know, scales or whatever it is, you know, that you're doing to warm up? I mean, do you just have to go back? I mean, we all have to go back to the pliés, and we have to go back to the bar work and so on. But within those structures, do you find that musicians are experimenting with very basic forms of warming up? Maybe the answer to that is no. Joseph?
I think, I mean, the kind of analog, I suppose, with what Susie's talking about is, you know, practicing scales and arpeggios. And I don't think there is a huge amount of creative experimentation done, partly because of the way that musical practice is taught in the UK and the requirements of grades. I don't know whether the same thing is true in dance education. So perhaps there is an element of physical experimentation in that kind of musical practice.
It's possible, yeah.
The physical experimentation is, yes, but the sort of creative experimentation,
yeah,
I never really considered that.
Yes, I'll just ask Gabriella something, and then you, Susie, again. Gabriella, your brother is a musician, I believe. Have you ever talked about these matters? Because I know you go to ballet class.
Yeah, it's interesting. My brother is a fairly serious musician on the side. It's not his professional career, and so he doesn't perform much. It's very much for himself. But it seems to me, as someone who gets to benefit from hearing this, that he tends to be very artistic in his practice, which is interesting that it's an artistic practice that is never performed. So there's something inherent for him about the artistry. Yeah.
Wonderful, wonderful, yeah. Susie, you had something to add.
I think I would, my sense and my desire as a teacher is that the notion of it as an artistic practice should be in everything, that there should be nothing that is just the equivalent of a mechanical scale. And I think it's hard to say that things like pliés are the equivalent of that, because to some extent they're always, class material is always choreographed, maybe, in a way that, or it should, I really believe, yes, it should never be, the technique and the artistry are so interwoven that there is, I think there has been a separation, and there's a danger of a separation when the class is viewed as a type of fitness or preparation for other things, other techniques, rather than everything that you do right from the beginning of the bar is about preparing dancing, exploring dancing, really. And I'm going to quote my teacher, Roger Tully, who says, "There are no exercises, there is only dancing."
That's very interesting. I would like to just go on a curveball a bit here and take that very question to Marcus and to Megan, and to ask them about writing and about the discipline of writing. I should be asking Alistair here first, but I think we'll come to Alistair later. Do you find that anything of these issues that have been raised in relation to practice, into warming up and so on, can be applied to the business of writing, but writing about a bodily form particularly, and about a musical form, because Megan was talking about, you know, the integration of those forms. Do you have anything to? Could you think of any way that this affects you?
Well, I was actually thinking, as you were talking about the sense of the artistry within the class, the continuous artistry, I was thinking about like the agency of the artist on and off stage. And I was thinking about that moment in Haskell's book where he's talking about the dancer playing Solor in La Bayadere, remaining Solor in the wings.
Wonderful, wonderful, yeah. Yes.
And this sense of the very blurred and perhaps complete lack of a line between the spectated space of the stage where there's an audience, and when you're off stage and there is no audience. And I suppose it's sort of where the ballet piece is made. Is it made out of the artistry of each dancer rather than just a that product?
Yeah, very interesting. What about you, Marcus? Have you had this this experience of, you know, you've been dancing quite a lot. I've seen you dance very, very well. And I wondered if you had that kind of experience of, you know, being both in the dance and retaining your own identity, but also melding together those experiences into your writing.
I think it's really hearing Susie and Parisa and Megan talk about this kind of practice. Something I've been reflecting a lot on during the period of confinement in the UK. I was part of a project, a live art and dance project called Meet Me Where I Am, at the beginning part of this, of lockdown. And it was really kind of apparent, the shift, like Susie, you were saying, of this kind of turn inward, but also being a turn towards the kind of techniques of the space that we were in. So it was a real attention to the camera itself, the lens of the camera, the hinge on which the laptop moves. And Parisa, I was just so struck by how you were saying that ballet gave you this kind of articulation of the feet and ankles through the tailor. And I was trying to figure, you know, what is this kind of technique of at-home practice that we're discovering? Like what is that allowing us to be precise with our bodies? And I think potentially it's a heightened kind of, what I'm feeling at the moment is an awareness of this idea of potentially social choreography, of distance, of proximity, of our kind of grounded embodied practice in space. Our bedrooms, our small living rooms, our kitchens, you know, turning a dance class and hitting the kitchen wall, or of all of this stuff, but also being outside and having them maintain 2 meter distance, this awareness of how the social is being choreographed at the moment, how aware everyone is of that distance, and how that is also being wrapped up into this moment of Black Lives Matter movement and activism, this protest, and this police response, right? So we're seeing this choreography of the state in this violent response in America in really, really visible ways. Something Andrea Lepecki talks about in choreographing choreopolitics and choreopolice, which is about riots in the 80s. But I think really this moment of practice and investigation does this for us as dancers, and I think it should be a moment of reflecting when we go back into the studios of how these things still stay with us as dancers in our body knowledge.
That's very interesting, because it's giving us a sense of the presence of the virtual, which is somehow something we haven't really taken on board. It is certainly in looking at dance history even. I mean, do you think so? Alistair, do you have anything to wrap up with there?
Well, you know,
where do we start?
you have opened so many doors in my mind as you're talking about aspects just of writing and connecting it to dance. And I love this point about connecting, say, Black Lives Matter, connecting it back to politics and society. How could we not? And all of you are talking about it as a form of communication, about the need of getting out there. It's not just for oneself. With writing, I'm absolutely aware that the more publicly you write, and I'm very much aware of this as a newspaper writer, which I was for 25 years, that it is performing. I used to feel at the New York Times, you've got to go out there, you're on the high wire, everybody's going to be gunning for you, so you've got to put on a show, you cannot be dull. You're going to be controversial anyway, so do it.
Yeah, I guess.
It was extraordinary. I just recently for City Centre was interviewing 3 ballerinas, Sarah Manns, Tyler Peck, Misty Copeland, and I found at one point I was absolutely talking their language because I was saying at the New York Times I was out there with a very intense, opinionated audience. Yes.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Parisa, did you have something to say there? Did you put your hand up?
Oh no,
No,
I mean,
okay. No, I was just thinking that what has been wonderful about this afternoon is that we haven't finished yet. In fact, we've only just scratched the surface, but we are beginning to see just how important, you know, dance actually is in relation to other art forms, in relation to whether it's a text or a performance. And all of these ideas have come together in this little round table. Now, I didn't give you a chance to ask your questions that you'd all prepared of one another. Is there anything? Are there any burning issues that came up? That, for example, Marcus, did you have a question for Gabriella? Was it, or for? No. If there's anything that anybody wants to ask it now, because we have to wrap up in 4 minutes.
I don't know about asking, but I would ask
Alistair.
Joseph for future reference about the distance between musicians reading something from a score and performing it. Very often we see musicians with the score in front of them, but of course in singing that's more or less impossible, certainly in opera. With dance, I heard Michael Novak, who now runs the Paul Taylor Company, say that the most formative experience of his career was as a student at Columbia University, learning Nijinsky's Afternoon of a Faun from Anne Hutchinson, the Laber notator. But then he was given, I think, at least a month to dwell on the thing he had learned from the notation and the distance of just learning the movement. That was the fundamental basic, but then he had to get through that to work out what the faun was about, what his motivation was, how that was going to project to an audience. And I'm sure that's what many musicians really instinctively are also working through. It's what happens in the performing arts.
Yes, indeed. Okay, anyone else? Thanks, Alistair, that's a great point. Anyone else have a question that they had prepared to bring with them? No?
Susie's waving her hand.
Just
Susie.
I just was really interested I wanted to ask Parisa about the training that, because I thought I was absolutely bowled over by the Paul Taylor solo, in which, and you had talked about his training as a swimmer and his study of ballet in the Cecchetti method and combined with Martha Graham technique. And I thought this was a really fascinating mixture. And I just wondered about what the classes that you do, the company does, the technique classes, do you do separate classes in distinct techniques, or is there an evolving Paul Taylor technique that you do, that you use in class, really?
Oh, that's a good question. I've only been thinking about this over the course of the last week or so, and actually a few weeks, because I was thinking of creating my own syllabi for teaching through distance. And I had a conversation with another Taylor dancer, Richard Chen-Si, who said that when the Taylor School was being developed, Reagan Wood, the director, had compiled syllabi from all these Taylor dance professors. And she said that she saw there were underpinnings of everybody's syllabus. So while Paul didn't necessarily create a technique to serve, like Graham, to serve the work, one has evolved. And so we can see all these influences of ballet and modern and going back to how to continue training and learning. I think as an artist, if you've stopped learning, if you've become bored, I mean, you know, we hold lawyers and attorneys and surgeons to such high degrees. I think we should, the same with artists, that you are perpetually learning. And, you know, quite often I think when, as a teacher, when you go into a ballet company to restage a work, there may never have been any exposure to any kind of modern dance, but you take what you have and you build upon it. And the tailor, I do think there is a tailor technique. From early classes when Paul used to teach on the road, when he was still dancing, we have developed like the back exercise, which I talk about in the lecture. We have different styles of what we call like a hand dance. He focused a lot on gestures. That is not necessarily what we do in tailor technique in terms of class, but there's a lot of discussion in class that I'm trying to, now my body understands it, but my mind is trying to articulate it and catch up with it. There's this resistance between this erect feeling, this very aristocratic balletic feeling, versus this very grounded, weighted, being able to drop to the floor and get up very quickly, which you aren't exposed necessarily in ballet. But to be able to, in the tailor style, to be able to turn at different levels off your central axis. So where you're initiating things from the back. So I might be turning, I can't show it now and I'm 8 months pregnant, where you're initiating the turn from the hip or the lower back in swats. These are some of the vocabulary that we use.
Yeah.
And there's verbiage, there's vocabulary, like piddly poo. These are words that came out of some of the fundamental early works that Paul had created. I could go on and on about
Well,
this.
it's wonderful. Actually, I keep thinking of all the questions I've got for you all. Parisa, the one thing that has stayed with me in my mind is the end of Beloved Renegade. Is that right, on that attitude pivot? He does that a lot, doesn't he? The pivot. And it always makes me think of the still point of the turning world of T.S. Eliot. Of course, I'm obsessed with T.S. Eliot.
Oh, gorgeous.
But I thought that brings together the poetic and the embodied in a way that's extremely subtle in Taylor. That his movement, he's just so exuberant all the time, so athletic, and yet there are these moments of stillness and centeredness that are profound and profoundly poetic, I think. Yeah.
I think Alistair speaks very beautifully about the solo in Brandenburg's.
Yes.
Which is also very similar, I think, to the solo in Oriole, where that three-dimensionality, it's, you don't know where one phrase begins and one ends, but it's very sculptural.
Yes.
It is poetic.
Indeed. Well, I think we've sort of come back to full circle now. And which was the question about, do we know about Taylor in the UK and in Ireland? Well, I've had a question here in the chat. I think you will have got it too, from Barbara Spender in New York, who saw Paul Taylor in Glasgow in 1989, and the audience were absolutely enraptured. So yes, people love him. It's very interesting to go back and think about that critical dissemination of Taylor. And also, all I have left really is to thank you all enormously for sitting through this. I've had building works next door for most of it, and I was trying to block it out. And for all of your patience in all the technical difficulties at the beginning, but great thanks to David for saving us and for continuing with the conversation. And let's hope we can do it again next year.
Next year.
Okay. Bye-bye, and thank you very much. Bye-bye.